can see in the book of Esther. And Esther is one of my favorite books in the Bible. And when we were, Dennis and Shannon and I were plotting out the preaching schedule, and we started in Genesis, we're going through the Bible. And when we got to Esther, I called dibs because it is one of my favorite stories. There's so much going on in the story of Esther. There's betrayal, there's intrigue, there's redemption, there's a story within a story happening in the book of Esther, because you know God is an amazing storyteller. And so I hope that today I can do justice to one of my very favorite books of the Bible, because I don't know if you know this or not, but Esther is a book in the Bible, part of the canon, the Old Testament, that never mentions the name of God. It's never mentioned. They fast, which was common among the people of that time, but they never specifically say God, they never say Yahweh, they never say the Lord, they never mention his name. And I think that you'll find by the time we get to the end of this today that they didn't need to, because God is so evident in what happens in the story of Esther that he didn't need his name to be mentioned to know that he was at work behind the scenes. Excuse me. So he uses some interesting people, some interesting circumstances to get his work done, to save his people from annihilation, which is what is actually the issue here. And he has a plan. Remember that. We can't ever forget that God has a plan. He had a plan from the beginning, and he made a promise. He made a promise to Abraham. He made a promise to David. And God keeps his promises. So we know that no matter what it seems like on the surface, God is working out his plan. And that's what we're going to be looking at today in the story of Esther, is God working out his plan. Now, last week, we heard about how the Israelites were given their freedom. They were given the option to go back home if they chose. And some of them did, but many of them remained where they were. I suppose they had settled in and they knew life as it was there, and so they just stayed. Why go somewhere new? An entire generation had gone by. So they stayed, and among those that stayed were Esther and her family, namely her cousin Mordecai. Mordecai had raised her. So Esther and her family, they stayed behind, and they're in the Persian province. And that's where our story opens in the book of Esther. King Xerxes, I know he has several names that he goes by, but Xerxes is easiest to say. So I'm going to call him King Xerxes. He's the king, and there's 127 provinces. And it says in the beginning of Esther that they went from India to Kush, to Ethiopia. So it's a very big kingdom that he has. So at the beginning of the book, he's having a big party. This party goes 6 months long. And after his party, he has a big feast. And basically, he's showing off his wealth. He's showing off his power. And at some point, at the end of the feast, he decides he wants to show off his queen. So he summons Queen Vashti to come with her crown and to parade in front of all of his cohorts. Well, the queen refused. And it does not tell us why she refused. I might like to think that she refused because she had enough self-worth and dignity to know that that was not a good idea, to parade herself in front of a bunch of drunken men. But whatever her reason was, we don't know. It didn't go well for her, based on her decision. She was deposed. She was thrown out of the palace, stripped of her crown. She is no longer Queen Vashti. So after a while, I think it was actually a few years, and a battle, Xerxes decides that he's kind of lonely and he misses having a queen around. So his people decide that a search will begin for a new queen. And so that's what they did. They sent out all throughout the provinces, and they gathered up all the beautiful young virgins, and they brought them back for King Xerxes. And essentially, each one of these girls, and we don't know, maybe they came by choice, maybe they were told, get in, we're going. We don't know. But each one of these girls got one night with the king to impress him, to win his favor, to please him. And if so, she could be named the next queen. Does this sound familiar at all to you? Does anybody watch The Bachelor? A bunch of young single women come and they're vying for the affections of one guy, and by a process of elimination, he whittles the group down to one lucky girl, and she gets the chance to be his. Well, that's what Esther was involved in. It was essentially like a beauty contest. King was the bachelor. So Esther was the favorite. Esther, hands down, was everybody's favorite. She was a beautiful girl. It tells us that in the Bible. And I think that we're going to see, as we go through the message today, that she was also humble. And she won favor first with Haggai. He was the eunuch who was in charge of all these girls. And she won his favor. So she got the best of everything because he liked her. She got all the great beauty treatments. She got all the great clothes. And then when her time came for her one night with the king, her beauty, her humility, whatever it was, she won the king over as well. And so she was given the crown, and she is now Queen Esther. Now, I told you that there's a lot going on in this story. So there's this whole bachelor beauty contest going on. And remember, Mordecai, he's Esther's cousin. He has a place at the gate. And I would think because of his place at the gate, he must have some high-ranking position, a civil position within the kingdom. So he's at the gate, and that gives him the opportunity. He overhears this plot to kill the king. So he takes that information and he gets it to Esther, and Esther gets it to the king, and the plot is thwarted. No more. And Mordecai is now given credit for saving the king's life. And it's written in the Chronicles of the King. Now, that's important later. This is written down in the Chronicles of the King. The king kind of owes him one now because Mordecai has saved his life, and it's been given credit in the books. Also, a man named Haman is promoted by the king, and he's given all kinds of power and authority. He's like the right-hand man of the king. And he loves this. You can see as you read the story of Esther that Haman is a very prideful man. And he's the kind of guy that needs you to know how important he is. And so all the people bow when Haman walks by. When he comes through the gate, everybody bows, except for Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow to the king, or to Haman. He refuses to bow to Haman. And that sets two dilemmas into action. The first is Mordecai's dilemma, because he refuses to bow down to Haman. Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. And if you're familiar with your history, this goes all the way back to King Saul. He was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, and he didn't. So now here's a descendant of that tribe coming back to cause trouble for the Jewish people. So he knows that he is an Amalekite, and Haman knows that Mordecai is a Jew. And Haman doesn't like the Jews. Not just he doesn't like them, he hates them. He can't stand the Jewish people. So he takes this opportunity to not just punish Mordecai, but he's going to punish all of the Jewish people. And in fact, he's just going to get rid of them. So he concocts this idea. He goes to the king, and he deceives the king with this decree that will annihilate the Jews, that will take out all of the Jews. And this decree, which, like a law, is not reversible. Once the king's seal is on it, and the king gave Haman his seal, once the king's seal is on that decree, he can't reverse it. So now the future of the Jewish people looks pretty bleak from the surface. From what we can see, it's dark days for the Jewish people. Their end is coming. It's something to remember that sometimes as aliens, as exiles, which we are also, if you are a believer, you are also an alien. This is not our home. Our home is in heaven. We are also, like Esther and Mordecai, aliens and exiles. And sometimes that means we have to endure injustices. We have to deal with untrue statements being made about us. I think if we look at the Middle East today, you see a lot, the Christians are enduring a lot of injustice around the world. But Esther and Mordecai were facing that. These things that Haman had presented against them were not true. And so here they had these untrue statements, these things that were about them. But they stood up to be counted as God's people. And that's what we have to do too. We have to remember that. So Mordecai, he's down at the gate again, and he overhears, or he finds out, he sees the decree posted of what Haman is up to. And so, once again, he goes to Esther, because Esther is in the palace, and she has influence over the king. She can get time with the king that Mordecai can't get. So, with Mordecai's encouragement, Esther used her position as queen to influence the king for the Jews. Did you get that? That's not fill in the blank. Okay, our second dilemma is now Esther's. She must face the king in order to plead her case for her people. However, if you go to the king without an invitation, you face death, because unless the king extends his golden scepter to accept you, you'll be killed. And Esther tells Mordecai that in chapter 4. She says, oh, but if I go to the king, I could face death. And the king hasn't requested my presence in over 30 days. So he hasn't really had any need to see Esther for 30 days anyways. So she's going to go and present herself knowing this and knowing that she's facing death. So she has a decision to make. Is she going to go and risk her life and hopefully save her people, or is she going to do nothing? So she instructs Mordecai to have all of the Jewish people fast. And she and her attendants are going to fast as well, because she knows that this is a big task in front of her, and she's going to need some help. She can't do this on her own. So she fasts, and she has everyone fast. Well, long story short, Esther faces the king. He does accept her, and we'll get a little bit more into it in a minute, but the Jewish people are given their freedom to protect themselves. The original decree was that they would just be killed and all of their stuff taken. Well, now they are able to protect themselves at least, to defend themselves. The decree has been made, though, and it can't be reversed. So Mordecai now becomes a higher ranking, like he's the next guy in charge. He's the prime minister. There's no one higher than him other than the king. Wasn't that Haman's place? Well, Haman is no more at the end of this story. The point is that Mordecai and Esther were aliens, but they were influential in their culture. 1 Peter 2:12 tells us, "Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world." God orchestrates these moments of influence for his people so that his kingdom will be advanced. Whether we see them or not, God is at work. So it seems that the fate of the Jewish people is riding on Esther. It's dependent on her response and on her courage. On the surface, without Queen Esther, the Jewish people will not be saved. And their story does not go on. The fate of the people is on her shoulders and her courage, it seems. But Mordecai's exhortation tells us something very different. His exhortation to Esther, it reminds us that if we don't take part, God will ultimately use someone else. I'm going to read you Esther chapter 4, 13 and 14. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Who knows? Who knows that you're in there right now where you are because God put you there for this exact moment? Think of those big players, the faith heroes that we know of from God's word. Abraham, Moses, David, Paul, Peter, they all did great things for God, great things for his kingdom. But they were really just ordinary guys. Esther was just an ordinary young girl, but God used them. They were pieces in a God-sized redemption story. And they were willing to be used by God to further his kingdom. Just like you and me. We're ordinary people, but when we're willing, God can use us to further his kingdom. So as God's kingdom advances, and it will keep going forward, you have to ask yourself, am I going to be a part of this? Am I going to take my part? Or am I going to stand by and do nothing? Am I going to let the influence that I've been given be unused? Don't be someone who looks back on your life and says, I wish I had been more courageous. I wish I had been more bold. I wish I had spoke up when. Don't let your influence that God has given you, your position, your place, that God has given you, be wasted by not using it. If we are going to play our part in how God lays out his kingdom, then the question becomes how. And this is where our story meets God's story. God has appointed us, and he has placed us in positions of influence so that we can play a part in furthering his kingdom. You may not feel like you have any influence. You may think, oh, who am I? I have no influence. I'm not important. But you do have influence. Maybe it's at school. Maybe it's on your job. Maybe it's in your neighborhood. Maybe it's within your own family. You have a circle of influence. And God can and will use you there if you are willing. There's no excuses because the kingdom is pushing forward. Are you going to be a part of it? In order to play our part, there's three things. Three things we must do. We must build humility into our Christian DNA. See, we're going to look first at Esther's humility and see how it worked in this story. She didn't reveal her nationality. Mordecai had instructed her from the beginning not to reveal that she was Jewish. And she kept that until the time was right. When she went to see the king and she revealed the plot, she revealed that she too was Jewish. She knew when to speak, when was the right time to speak. And she fasted because she knew that her position was not enough. Yeah, she was the queen. But even as the queen, if she went before the king and he didn't want to see her, it didn't matter that she was the queen. She knew that her position wasn't going to be enough. She was going to need some supernatural wisdom and guidance if her plan was going to come out in her favor. And don't forget Mordecai's reminder. If she wasn't willing, somebody else would do the job. She took advice from people more knowledgeable than her. She was teachable. She didn't think she knew everything. She was willing to listen to wise counsel. Think of it as do what you do and be who you are. Esther was beautiful. It says in the word, Esther was a beautiful young girl. And Esther was loyal. She was loyal to her family. She was loyal to the Jewish people. And she was smart. She was smart enough to know that she couldn't do it alone, that she needed help. And she was smart enough to ask for help. So her humble actions, they weren't something that came about in the moment. These were things that were habits in her life that had been established long before her moment in the spotlight. Her habit of humility didn't come from the moment. It came from habit in her life. Earthly authority and influence can lead to pride, but those who use that authority in wisdom, they know that it has to be accompanied by humility. Look at the difference between Haman and Esther. Haman thought he knew everything. Haman thought he was above everybody. He didn't listen to wise counsel. Actually, the counsel he listened to got him in trouble. His wife and his friends and his family. He wasn't humble at all. Esther's habit of humility called on God's presence because humility invokes presence. When we're full of pride, we don't think we need God. But when we're humble, we know that we can't do it on our own. Humility invokes presence. And we have to recognize that God's presence, even when his name is not mentioned. Remember, through the whole book of Esther, God is not mentioned. I want to read you chapter 6, starting at verse 1. And listen carefully to all the things that go on in these few verses. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outside court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. How about that irony? Did you get all that? God is an amazing storyteller. So God, he doesn't have to have his name mentioned to be at work. We see it in what Mordecai says to Esther. Don't think for a minute you'll be spared, and if you don't do it, God will raise up somebody who will. And then King Xerxes can't sleep. He has insomnia, so he has the Chronicles brought to him. The very chronicle that notes that Mordecai saved his life. All these things as a whole, they show us that there's more going on than we can see. God is at work. And some might say, this is a coincidence. He just happened to grab that book. It's a coincidence. But we know that our Creator and our Redeemer was behind the whole thing. His hands were all over this. Right? Many of us today, there's a big cry to have God back in our schools, in our public schools. We want God back in, we want his name, we want the prayer, we want it all back in the public schools. And I understand that. Our kids go to a Christian school. So I understand that. But you know, God doesn't need his name to be in that public school, to be working in that school. He has Christian teachers there. He has Christian administrators there. He has Christian children there. He doesn't need his name to be mentioned for his work to be done in his kingdom to be furthered. We need it. We need his name so that we can feel like our nation isn't going to hell in a handbasket. We need. But God doesn't need it because he's working no matter what. He's going behind the scenes doing things that we can't see yet. We don't have to have a Christian coach for our kids' sports team or a Christian piano teacher for them to learn from. What we need is for us, the parents, the grandparents, the family, to teach our children, to teach them by example, not just by word, by example, to be salt and light in a dark world, to be willing to be an influencer in an alien world. We need to teach them that. Humility invokes presence, and presence brings resolve. But did you get the order? The order is important because resolve follows presence and presence follows humility. We can't get them out of order. We have to keep our resolve in the midst of influential moments. We know that Daniel resolved to keep himself pure. And we can see from the actions of Mordecai and Esther that they also kept their resolve. Mordecai wouldn't bow to a man that he knew was not honorable. And Esther courageously spoke up just at that right time. 1 Peter 2:13 tells us, submit to authority for the Lord's sake, which means we can still give those in positions of authority over us honor, but we don't have to bow down. Mordecai and Esther both teach us this, because respect is earned, honor is given. Mordecai took the words of the prophet Jeremiah to heart, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you. I think we need to take that at heart too. God has placed you where you are, wherever that may be. And you need to seek the welfare there and be kingdom-minded and not kingdom-minded. We need to be kingdom-minded wherever we are and whatever we do. So there's two results that came out of Esther's story. First was the establishment of the festival or the celebration of Purim. And that is still celebrated today by Jewish people, to remember how God saved them from their enemies. And secondly, it says right in there in the book of Esther that people of other nationalities became Jewish, like they converted. Because Esther and Mordecai used their influence to make a difference in their culture, and other people wanted to be a part of what they were. They wanted to be a part of God's people. Use your influence. If you want to be influential in your circle, don't dilute your standards. You got to live them out with resolve. It's resolve, though, in God's sovereignty that influences. Even though God's name was not specifically mentioned, his sovereignty is obvious in the story of Esther. The author didn't need to mention God because God was all over it. His fingerprints are everywhere in the story of Esther. There's Esther was chosen over all the other women, all the other young girls. Esther was chosen. Mordecai had a position at the gate. And because of that, he heard the plot to kill the king. And Esther is now in the palace, and she has a position to influence the king. The king's insomnia, remember that? And how he was reminded of what Mordecai did for him. And then Mordecai was honored just at the time when Haman was coming to try to destroy Mordecai. And the tables were turned on Haman, and he was destroyed instead. All these things weren't coincidence. All of these things were the result of God working out his plan and using those who were willing to play their part. There's a song, I'm not going to sing, but there's a song called I Refuse. It's by Josh Wilson. And I just want to read you just a couple of lyrics of it to think about. It's called I Refuse. This world needs God, but it's easier to stand and watch. I could say a prayer and just move on like nothing's wrong, but I refuse. Because I don't want to live like I don't care. I don't want to say another empty prayer. I refuse to sit around and wait for someone else to do what God has called me to do myself. I could choose not to move, but I refuse. Are you going to choose to move, to be used? Because if you call yourself a Christian, you have a part to play. And God has given you a circle of influence. He has given you people around you and circumstances around you where you can influence for the furthering of his kingdom. Not yours, his kingdom. That's what we should be about. That's what should be here and here, is furthering the kingdom of God. Because that's what really matters in the end. You want to practice that habit of humility. Start it now. If you don't already have a habit of humility, start practicing it now. Be teachable. Listen to the wise counsel of other people. And make sure that it's wise counsel. Fast and pray and seek the Lord in all your decisions. Sometimes we think, oh, well, God doesn't care about that. But I believe that he does. He cares about us, and he cares about the things that we do and the decisions that we make. So seek the Lord in all of your decisions. Be humble and know that you can't do it alone. You need him and you need fellow believers to do the things that need to be done. Go from doing nothing to letting God use you where you are, to change our culture and influence it for his kingdom. Esther's moment came at a time of peril. She needed to stand up. She needed to be courageous to make wise decisions. A lot rode on Esther's decision. And ours may look different. Ours may not seem as big as Esther's. But if God is calling you to something, believe me, it's as big. It may not seem as big to you, but if it's the eternal resting place of someone you know, then it's as big as what Esther was facing. God wants to use you. He wants to use each one of us to influence, and he wants to use the influence you have to make a difference. He's chosen you to take part, and he has moments of influence for you. And you have to decide, are you going to be a part of it or not?